We expected the whip of vengeance. Instead, they offered us cigarettes. The words were scribbled in the diary of a captured German soldier in the summer of 1943. They capture, in a single breath, the shock and disbelief that would define the journey of thousands of men who laid down their arms in North Africa. It was May. The desert sun hung heavy over Tunisia, casting long, wavering shadows across a landscape littered with broken vehicles, discarded helmets, and the weary remnants of Rommel's once feared Africa corpse. Dust clung to every surface. Flies swarmed over rotting rations. And marching across the sand, under the watchful eyes of American guards, were columns of prisoners, thin, sunburned, and hollow-eyed. For months they had fought under impossible conditions. Supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Bread was stale, water scarce, fuel nearly gone. Many had been forced to eat whatever they could scavenge. Some had chewed cactus flesh for moisture. Others, too exhausted to carry their rifles, abandoned them on the battlefield. By May 13, 1943, over 250,000 Axis troops, Germans and Italians, had surrendered in North Africa. Among them were young soldiers barely out of school and veterans hardened by years of war. Now, stripped of their weapons, they shuffled forward with only fear in their hearts. For these men, captivity was a terrifying prospect. Nazi propaganda had painted a vivid picture of what awaited them. Brutal treatment, starvation, perhaps even execution at the hands of vengeful Americans. Some whispered rumors of lynch mobs, of chains, of endless hard labor in mines. The idea of being carted across the ocean, far from Europe, was beyond comprehension. What would become of them? The first encounter shattered expectations. American guards, though stern and disciplined, did not beat or curse at them. Some even offered cigarettes, tossing the precious rolls of tobacco toward men who hadn't tasted one in weeks. A stunned silence followed, broken by hesitant laughter, cautious gratitude. The prisoners had braced for cruelty. Instead, they found something disarming: decency. Their journey into captivity was just beginning. From makeshift desert stockades, they were herded into transport ships at Allied ports. Packed into the holds, they crossed the vast Atlantic, seasickness mixing with dread. Many stared at the horizon, wondering if they would ever see their homeland again. Inside the steel hulls, conversations turned to speculation. Would America parade them through streets as trophies? Would they be executed quietly, away from the eyes of the world? When daylight streamed through hatches, some saw glimpses of dolphins chasing the bow, or flying fish scattering from the wake. But for most, the ocean crossing was a blur of heat, noise, and anxiety. Their minds clung to the images of ruined German cities, of families back home rationing every crumb. What awaited across the sea seemed like another planet. Behind this massive transfer lay strategy. The Allies wanted German prisoners as far away from the European theater as possible. Britain, already strained with its own resources, could not house hundreds of thousands more. America, with its vast land and relative safety from bombing raids, became the chosen destination. For the United States, bringing POWs across the ocean solved two problems. It kept enemy soldiers secure and provided manpower for an economy stretched thin by war. The irony was bitter. Soldiers who had been fighting to destroy America would soon find themselves working in its fields, factories, and forests. But none of that was known yet to the men trudging onto those ships. To them, America was a mystery, a place of skyscrapers and jazz music, cowboys and endless highways, a land both feared and envied. Fear was their companion on that voyage. Yet in moments of stillness, some prisoners admitted a quiet relief. They were alive. They had survived Rommel's desert campaign, the bombings, the chaos of defeat. Whatever lay ahead, it could not be worse than the slaughter they had left behind. as the Atlantic waves crashed against steel hulls. These men carried with them memories of dust and fire, of hunger and despair. They expected a hard fate in America, perhaps worse than death. But what awaited them would defy belief. They would not find chains or cruelty. Instead, they would step into a world overflowing with food, comfort, and a baffling generosity. Their story was about to take a turn they never could have imagined. And so, from the blistering heat of Tunisia to the rolling seas of the Atlantic, the journey of the German prisoners was only at its beginning. The barbed wire camps of America waited, places where the taste of a donut or the fizz of a Coca-Cola would leave more lasting impressions than the clash of tanks or the roar of artillery. As the ships neared American shores, the prisoners braced themselves for humiliation and hardship. What they found instead was something entirely unexpected, a land of abundance that would forever alter their perception of the war and of their enemy. The first glimpse of America came not with fanfare, but with silence. It was early morning when the troopships, heavy with thousands of German prisoners, glided into New York Harbor. Mist clung to the water, and then, as if unveiled by the hand of history itself, the skyline appeared. Steel towers rose like jagged cliffs above the ocean, their windows glittering with sunlight. Some prisoners pressed their faces against portholes, others leaned over railings despite the barked orders of guards. What they saw stunned them. A city untouched by war. No ruins, no bomb craters, no smoke curling from shattered rooftops. Just endless streets, bustling docks, and a colossal statue, torch raised high, greeting them with stone serenity. For men who had grown used to the rubble of Bremen, Hamburg, and Cologne, the sight was otherworldly. One prisoner whispered, "If this is the land we fight against, then we have already lost." The arrival was carefully managed. Armed soldiers lined the docks, rifles gleaming in the sun, but their discipline was calm, not cruel. Prisoners filed down gangplanks, their boots striking the wooden planks in steady rhythm. They expected jeers, perhaps rotten food thrown by an angry crowd. Instead, dockworkers watched in quiet curiosity. Some Americans craned their necks to glimpse the infamous enemy, but few shouted insults. Most were too busy loading crates, rushing supplies, or waving at soldiers returning from Europe. Processing began swiftly. The Germans were herded into warehouses, converted into makeshift reception centers. Here, another surprise awaited. Efficiency, order, and even a kind of care. Doctors checked for lice, infections, and malnutrition. Medics handed out soap and bandages. To men who had gone weeks without bathing, the chance to scrub clean felt almost luxurious. Then came food. Prisoners shuffled into long mess lines, trays clattering in their hands. The smells alone were dizzying. Roasted meat, potatoes, warm bread, steaming coffee. And on the side tables sat bowls of fruit, stacks of donuts, and bottles of something fizzy and dark, Coca-Cola. For many Germans, this was the first time they had ever seen such items. Europe had been strangled by rationing for years. Sugar was scarce, meat rarer still. Civilians at home boiled turnips for soup and stood in endless queues for a few ounces of butter. Here, in the enemy's country, prisoners found tables sagging under abundance. The reaction was disbelief. Some ate cautiously, as though expecting a trick. Others wolfed down their portions, only to sit in stunned silence afterward, too full for the first time in months. One soldier later wrote, "I had thought America a land of greed, yet the first day they gave me more food than my mother could find in a month." It wasn't just the quantity, it was the strangeness. White bread so soft it seemed unreal, donuts glazed with sugar so sweet it hurt the teeth, and Coca-Cola, with its sharp fizz and caramel tang, left men sputtering, laughing, confused by the bubbles dancing on their tongues. In their letters, Many described Coke not as a drink, but as a mystery. But abundance was not without irony. Across the ocean, German families starved under Allied bombing and blockade. Mothers stretched rations to feed children. Fathers risked arrest trading on black markets. For the men in American custody, writing letters home was painful. How could they tell their families they were being fed better by their captors than by their own government? Some hid the truth. Others wrote with guilt, confessing that captivity felt like an escape from misery. Once processed, the prisoners were sorted. Some boarded trains bound for sprawling camps in the Midwest and South. From the windows, they watched farmland roll past in endless waves of green and gold. Barns painted bright red, children playing in fields, churches with tall white steeples, all painted a picture of prosperity far removed from their own shattered homeland. The irony deepened with every mile. Here they were, enemies of America, transported not to grim stone fortresses, but to camps surrounded by barbed wire amid towns where locals waved as trains rolled by. A new chapter of their captivity had begun, one defined not by brutality, but by baffling generosity. For many Germans, the first hours on American soil were the most disorienting of their lives. They had expected hate and found indifference. They had braced for starvation and found donuts and Coca-Cola. They had imagined a land of chaos, only to discover order, abundance, and a sense of calm that seemed impossible in war. Yet questions lingered in every prisoner's mind. Why? Why would America treat its enemies so well? The answer lay not only in kindness, but in calculation, a strategy rooted in politics, image, and the Geneva Convention. That truth would soon reveal itself inside the barbed wire. Winning hearts was as important as winning battles. The phrase was repeated in Washington corridors, among Army officials and State Department planners, long before the first German prisoner set foot on American soil. To the casual eye, the surprising generosity shown to captured enemy soldiers looked like simple kindness. In truth, it was policy, carefully calculated, deeply strategic, and rooted in both humanitarian ideals and political necessity. At the core stood the Geneva Convention of 1929, an international agreement designed to protect prisoners of war from abuse. America, still mindful of its reputation after the First World War, was determined to uphold the rules. Treatment of German captives would be a test of America's credibility, not just to Germany, but to the world. The government wanted to show that it was a nation of law, not vengeance. And so every meal served, every medical check offered, every letter home permitted, became part of a larger performance, the United States demonstrating its moral high ground. But morality was only half the story. The other half was pragmatism. American leaders knew thousands of GIs were already in German hands. News of mistreated POWs could break morale on the home front. Conversely, if German soldiers returned home telling stories of fair treatment in the United States, perhaps their countrymen would hesitate before brutalizing American captives. In that sense, every donut and every bottle of Coca-Cola was a diplomatic weapon designed to safeguard the lives of American sons across the ocean. There was also the propaganda war. Nazi broadcasts had long insisted that surrendering to the Americans meant certain death. Goebbels' ministry painted lurid images of lynchings, starvation camps, and cruel tortures. German soldiers were told they would be treated like animals, stripped of dignity, and exterminated far from home. Yet reality could not have been more different. When prisoners discovered they were fed, clothed, and even allowed recreation, the contrast itself became a form of propaganda, working against the Reich. Letters smuggled back to Germany whispered the truth: "We are treated better here than at home." For American officials, this contrast was priceless. It eroded faith in Nazi leadership and subtly spread the message that the enemy's regime had lied to them. In some ways, the U.S. did not even need to broadcast its intentions. The simple act of humane treatment spoke louder than any radio transmission. Economics also played a part. With millions of American men deployed overseas, labor shortages gripped the home front. Fields went unharvested, factories struggled to meet quotas, railroads cried out for manpower. By treating German POWs well, the U.S. could integrate them into the workforce under the Geneva Rules, using their labor while maintaining international legitimacy. Feeding them well was not just generosity, it was investment. A healthy worker was a productive worker. Inside the camps, these policies took tangible form. Men were paid small wages for their labor, allowed to spend them on camp canteens stocked with American goods. They received medical care, education, even access to libraries. Some were astonished to see American newspapers delivered daily, carrying both Allied victories and criticisms of U.S. leaders. "You can print this," one prisoner asked in disbelief, pointing to a headline questioning President Roosevelt. For men raised under strict censorship, it was another revelation. In America, even prisoners could glimpse freedom. Still, not everyone in the United States welcomed this policy. Stories spread of German soldiers eating steak dinners, while American families endured rationing. Editorials questioned why the enemy was treated so comfortably. Some guards and civilians resented seeing the very men who had fought against their brothers treated with what looked like indulgence. But the military stood firm. The rules had to be followed, the image preserved. Humane treatment was not a luxury, it was a weapon of war. And so the paradox grew sharper. Prisoners expecting to be broken instead found themselves, in many cases, restored. Starving men gained weight. Sick soldiers recovered strength. Men who had been indoctrinated with hatred discovered a society that, even in wartime, extended decency to its foes. It was a strange kind of battlefield. One fought not with bullets, but with bread, not with tanks, but with trust. The larger message was clear. America did not just want to defeat Germany, it wanted to show what victory looked like. Victory was not vengeance. Victory was confidence, stability, abundance. For the men behind the barbed wire, this realization would slowly begin to take root, shaking the very foundations of what they had been taught. Yet policies and principles, however noble, are only words until lived. For the prisoners, the proof of America's intentions came in daily routines, the meals, the work, the quiet hours of camp life. Behind the fences, a new rhythm emerged, one that would reshape their expectations in ways they never could have foreseen. The day began not with the thunder of artillery, but with the clang of a bell. At dawn, the guards walked the perimeters of the camp, boots crunching on gravel, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Inside the barbed wire fences, German prisoners stirred awake in their barracks. Long wooden huts filled with rows of bunks, wool blankets, and the faint smell of soap and tobacco. For many, the first shock was how ordinary it all felt. Prison, they had imagined, would mean chains, darkness, and cruelty. Instead, life in an American POW camp resembled, in many ways, the order of a small town. The barracks were clean. The roofs kept out the rain. The stoves provided heat in winter. It was not luxury, but it was not misery either. Breakfast followed quickly. Prisoners lined up in the mess hall, trays in hand, as the smell of hot coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Sometimes there was oatmeal or bacon, sometimes pancakes, sometimes even donuts, dusted with sugar. For men who had scraped mold-off bread crusts in the desert, the abundance was surreal. The noise of spoons clattering, of men laughing cautiously, replaced the sounds of battle they had once known. After breakfast came work. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to labor, provided it was not directly for the war effort. So the men were divided into groups. Some were sent to local farms, where they harvested wheat, picked fruit, or milked cows. Others repaired roads, cut timber, or dug irrigation ditches. A few, skilled in trades, worked as carpenters or mechanics inside the camp itself. The irony was heavy. Soldiers who had fought to bring America to its knees were now helping sustain its farms and factories. Farmers often remarked on the prisoners' discipline. They worked hard, followed orders, and rarely caused trouble. Some even whistled German folk songs as they swung scythes under the American sun. When the day's labor was done, the camp came alive in its own peculiar rhythm. Some prisoners played soccer on makeshift fields, kicking patched-up leather balls while guards leaned on fences to watch. Others gathered in shaded corners to play chess, carve wooden toys, or write letters. The canteen offered small luxuries, razor blades, cigarettes, stationery, sometimes even chocolate bars. Men hoarded these treasures, trading among themselves like schoolboys. Education became another feature of camp life. American authorities, keen to provide more than just food and work, allowed classes in languages, mathematics, and literature. Some prisoners learned English. Others studied agriculture, engineering, or philosophy. In a few camps, orchestras formed, their violins and brass instruments filling the evening air with Beethoven and Schubert. It was a strange, almost surreal coexistence, art and music thriving behind barbed wire. But beneath the calm surface lay complicated emotions. Many prisoners felt a gnawing guilt. Their letters home revealed it. I eat 3 times a day, while you must queue for hours to buy bread. Forgive me. Some avoided writing the truth, ashamed that they lived in comfort, while families in Germany endured bombing, hunger, and fear. Captivity became a paradox, safer, healthier, and in some ways freer than life back home. Tensions still existed. Not all guards were friendly. Some treated prisoners harshly, quick with insults or punishments. Within the camps, divisions lingered. Hardcore Nazis tried to enforce loyalty, sometimes intimidating fellow prisoners. But the fences also held space for doubt. Many young soldiers, freed from constant propaganda, began questioning the ideals they had once sworn to defend. The sensory details of daily life became unforgettable. The hiss of a Coca-Cola bottle opening, the sweet glaze of a donut melting on the tongue, the sound of American swing music playing faintly from a guardhouse radio. These ordinary moments imprinted themselves as strongly as the memories of tanks and desert marches. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the barracks glowed with quiet conversations. Some men lay awake, listening to the chirp of crickets beyond the wire, wondering if their families were still alive. Others dreamed of returning to ruined cities, imagining reunions, dreading losses. Behind the fences, time moved strangely, slower than the war, yet filled with unexpected discoveries. What had begun as captivity was slowly becoming transformation. The camps were not just places of confinement. They were classrooms, workplaces, even communities where men learned more about their enemy than they ever had in battle. Yet the true shocks of American life were still to come. For beyond the fences, in the simplest of foods and drinks, prisoners would encounter the most astonishing symbols of their captivity: donuts, Coca-Cola, and a culture unlike anything they had ever known. The moment was simple, almost comical. A German prisoner, thin from months of desert rations, held in his hand a round pastry glistening with sugar. He sniffed it suspiciously, then took a cautious bite. His eyes widened. Sweetness flooded his mouth, richer than anything he had tasted in years. For a moment, the war vanished. The man grinned like a child. It was his first donut. Across the table, another prisoner tilted a glass bottle filled with dark liquid. He raised it to his lips, took a swallow, and sputtered as bubbles stung his throat. The camp erupted in laughter. The drink fizzed and crackled on his tongue, leaving a taste of caramel and spice. It was Coca-Cola, the most ordinary of American beverages, yet to these men, it was pure astonishment. Such small encounters became unforgettable markers of captivity. The contrast was shocking. In Germany, food was rationed to the bone. Sugar, coffee, and meat were luxuries few could obtain. Families stretched thin soups, boiled turnips, and baked coarse bread with sawdust fillers. Here, in the land of their enemy, prisoners were offered treats Americans considered everyday snacks. Letters home revealed the disbelief. One soldier confessed, "Today I drank something called Coca-Cola. It burns and tickles. Children here must live like kings." Another described donuts as small cakes, round and soft, given freely in the morning. Their words carried a tone of wonder, but also guilt. How could they admit to their families, enduring bombings and hunger, that they were eating pastries behind barbed wire? The cultural shock extended beyond food. Guards played swing music from radios in the barracks. Prisoners listened baffled to the lively rhythms of Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller. Some tapped their feet unconsciously, caught between shame and joy. Baseball, played on nearby fields, added to the sense of strangeness. To German eyes, the sport looked chaotic. Men running in circles, rules hard to follow. Yet they marveled at the sheer energy and cheer of the game. Even the simple act of abundance was shocking. A bottle of Coca-Cola, once emptied, was thrown away by Americans. Prisoners, raised on scarcity, collected the empties, turning them into vases or candle holders. Donuts, sometimes left half-eaten by guards, were snatched up by prisoners eager to savor every crumb. The wastefulness seemed as incredible as the taste itself. But behind the laughter and curiosity lay deeper questions. Was this real America, or was it a show designed to lure them? Nazi propaganda had told them that Americans were decadent, weak, corrupted by greed. Yet here was a country that could feed even its enemies better than Germany fed its own people. The irony was bitter. Some prisoners began to connect the dots. If Americans lived with such abundance, what chance did Germany truly have? How could a nation struggling to supply its armies hope to outlast a country where even prisoners received donuts for breakfast? The emotional toll was complex. Joy at simple pleasures mixed with shame at the contrast. Some men wrote cautiously, careful not to wound their families with tales of Coca-Cola and white bread. Others avoided the subject altogether, preferring silence to guilt. But among themselves, the prisoners laughed, joked, and remembered these moments as proof they had stumbled into another world. For younger soldiers, especially, the cultural experiences left lasting impressions. They learned English phrases from guards, tried American chewing gum, and practiced baseball with improvised bats. What began as captivity slowly transformed into accidental education, an immersion into a culture their leaders had demonized, but that they now saw with their own eyes. Still, not every man welcomed it. Hardcore loyalists scoffed at the fascination with donuts and Coke, sneering that it was proof of American decadence. To them, the sweets and sodas were temptations meant to soften German resolve. But for the majority, these experiences stuck like memories of another life, small, sugary reminders that the enemy's world was not as monstrous as they had been told. And so, behind the barbed wire, the symbols of America revealed themselves not in tanks or planes, but in pastries and soda bottles. For men torn from the dust of North Africa and the hunger of wartime Europe, the taste of sugar and fizz became more than a novelty. It became a revelation. Yet the shocks of America did not stop at camp gates. Soon, prisoners would step into local communities, working on farms, meeting civilians, and discovering that even beyond the fences, the enemy could become something far more unsettling: a neighbor, even a friend. The buses rattled down dusty country roads, their windows guarded by American soldiers. Inside sat rows of German prisoners, their uniforms stripped of insignia, their faces weary but curious. Beyond the glass stretched the heartland of America. Vast fields of corn and wheat, red barns glowing in the sun, children waving from porches as the convoy passed. For many prisoners, it was the first glimpse of rural America, green, fertile, and untouched by the war-consuming Europe. Their destination was not a fortress or a dungeon, but farms and factories. America needed hands. With so many young men overseas, the nation faced a labor shortage. The solution was pragmatic. German prisoners would work in the fields, harvest crops, repair fences, and keep the machinery of civilian life running. When the buses arrived, locals gathered hesitant and wary. Housewives peeked from kitchen doors, farmers leaned on fence posts, children whispered behind their mothers' skirts. Here were the enemy soldiers, men who had worn swastikas, who had once cheered Hitler's speeches. What might they do? The first encounters were cautious. A farmer handed a prisoner a shovel, pointing toward a row of potatoes. The German bent down and worked, quiet and efficient. Another carried buckets of water. Hours passed, and nothing dangerous happened. Slowly, suspicion gave way to surprise. The prisoners were not monsters. They were just men, tired, polite, even eager to work. Stories spread quickly. Farmers discovered that many Germans were skilled, disciplined, and hardworking. They sang as they labored, whistling folk songs while tossing hay bales into lofts. Some wrote thank you notes in careful English after being given meals. One farmer's wife recalled, "They were better behaved than some of the boys from town." Human moments began to break down barriers. On hot days, farm wives carried out pitchers of lemonade or slices of pie. Children watched wide-eyed as prisoners carved toys from wood scraps, little animals, spinning tops, miniature houses. Some kids traded comic books for these handmade treasures, marveling at the enemy's craftsmanship. The irony was striking. Sworn enemies were now neighbors, even guests. Some locals even grew fond of the prisoners, treating them almost like adopted farmhands. Yet not everyone was comfortable. For families who had lost sons in the war, seeing Germans walk free in their fields was a bitter sight. Newspaper editorials questioned the generosity. Why should the enemy eat American food while soldiers starved overseas? Still, day by day, ordinary interactions chipped away at fear. A prisoner shared stories of his hometown near Munich. A farmer compared it to his own small town in Iowa. Both men laughed at the similarity. Another prisoner showed children how to sing a German folk song, only to be taught Yankee Doodle in return. Behind the wire, they had tasted donuts and Coca-Cola. Outside, they now tasted something equally strange: acceptance. These exchanges carried deeper consequences. For many prisoners, contact with American civilians shattered the image of the enemy crafted by Nazi propaganda. They had been told Americans were greedy, violent, and godless. Yet here they found kindness, hospitality, and even respect. A slice of apple pie offered at the end of a long workday could carry more weight than a dozen speeches. Of course, suspicion lingered. Guards kept a close watch, and escapes did occur, though few succeeded. Most prisoners realized they had little reason to flee. They were safer here than in war-torn Europe, and more than that, they were beginning to question the world they had left behind. The emotional impact cut both ways. For Americans, seeing their enemies up close revealed that Germans were not faceless villains. They were young men with families, laughter, and grief. For Germans, meeting American families showed them a country not defined by decadence or cruelty, but by community and abundance. By the end of the war, thousands of such encounters had taken place across the Midwest and South. Some farm families remembered the Germans fondly for decades. Some former prisoners wrote back, after the war, sending letters of gratitude. What began in fear had often ended in unexpected friendship, but as relationships softened and bonds formed, something even more profound was happening inside the camps themselves. The enemy was not only being fed and sheltered, they were being confronted with ideas. Propaganda began to crack, and for many German prisoners, the greatest shock was not donuts or Coca-Cola, but freedom of thought. We had been told America was a land of chaos and cruelty. Instead, we saw churches, schools, and freedom. The words came from a German prisoner, reflecting on his time in captivity. They capture the quiet revolution that took place inside the barbed wire, not of weapons, but of minds. At first, many prisoners clung tightly to Nazi propaganda. Within the barracks, hardcore loyalists tried to maintain control, barking orders, organizing clandestine meetings, even punishing men who dared to criticize Hitler. Swastikas were carved into wooden walls. Whispers of loyalty to the Reich floated through the night. For them, captivity was a test of faith, and any sign of softness toward the Americans was betrayal. But cracks soon began to appear. Daily experiences undermined the propaganda they had absorbed for years. They had been told Americans were barbaric, yet guards treated them with fairness. They had been told America was lawless, yet newspapers carried open criticism of the government without fear. They had been told democracy was a sham, yet they saw workers vote for union leaders, towns electing officials, and even prisoners given the chance to express opinions in camp councils. For many, this was bewildering. They had grown up in a system where dissent was dangerous, where fear shaped every conversation. Here, behind enemy wire, they found more freedom of thought than in the Reich itself. Education became a powerful tool. Camps established libraries, stocked with English and German books. Newspapers arrived daily, filled not just with Allied victories, but also with stories of strikes, scandals, and debates in Congress. To German eyes, this openness was astonishing. "Your government allows this?" one prisoner asked a guard, pointing at a headline criticizing President Roosevelt. For men conditioned to believe that criticism equaled treason, the idea was revolutionary. Some camps went further. Re-education programs introduced lectures on democracy, history, and philosophy. Former German anti-Nazis, captured or exiled, spoke directly to prisoners, challenging them to reconsider the regime they had fought for. Films showed images of German atrocities, evidence many dismissed at first, but could not completely ignore. Discussions sparked arguments. Slowly, seeds of doubt grew. Music and culture played their part too. Prison orchestras performed Beethoven alongside American jazz, blending traditions that once seemed worlds apart. Prisoners who learned English began translating American songs, their rhythms echoing through the barracks. The simple joy of swing music, untainted by ideology, became a quiet rebellion against everything they had been taught. Not all prisoners embraced these changes. Loyalists resisted fiercely, sometimes threatening or even attacking fellow captives who appeared too friendly with Americans. The camps were not free of violence. Tensions simmered between those still devoted to the Reich and those beginning to let go. Yet over time, the balance shifted. The allure of donuts, Coca-Cola, books, and music, combined with daily examples of fairness, eroded even the hardest resistance. One prisoner later wrote, "I came as a Nazi. I left with questions. Why had I believed lies so easily? Why did I not see the truth until it came from my enemy?" His words echoed the journeys of many. For them, captivity was not just physical, it was a passage out of blind faith. The irony was stark. The men were fenced in by barbed wire, watched by armed guards. Yet in their minds they tasted a freedom that had been denied to them in their own homeland. Behind the fences, the Reich's grip loosened. In America, the enemy was not beaten with fists, but with ideas. By the time victory neared, thousands of prisoners carried within them a changed perception. They would return to Germany with stories not of cruelty, but of decency, not of chaos, but of democracy in action. And those stories would ripple outward, shaping how post-war Germans viewed their former foes. Yet before those stories could spread, the war itself had to end. And when it did, the camps did not vanish overnight. For the prisoners, victory brought not freedom, but a strange limbo, a time of waiting, wondering, and absorbing even more of America's strange, abundant culture. May 8, 1945. The world erupted in celebration. Across Europe, church bells rang, fireworks lit the skies, and Allied soldiers cheered as the news spread. Victory in Europe, the war that had consumed a continent, was finally over. Inside American prisoner of war camps, the news arrived with a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. Prisoners crowded around radios as announcers declared Germany's unconditional surrender. Some cheered, others wept. For many, the emotions were tangled. Joy that the bloodshed had ended, sorrow for a defeated homeland, dread for what awaited their families in the ruins. That night, American towns near the camps exploded with parties. Flags waved, bands played, people poured into the streets. From behind the barbed wire, prisoners could see the glow of fireworks in the distance, hear the muffled echoes of horns and laughter. Victory had come, but for them, it did not bring release. The irony was painful. The war was finished, yet the fences remained. German soldiers had expected that surrender would mean swift repatriation. Instead, they were told they would stay in America until transportation could be arranged. With millions of men to send back across the Atlantic and Europe in chaos, the process would take months, sometimes years. For the prisoners, captivity entered a new phase, waiting. The daily routine continued much as before. Morning roll call, work details, meals in the mess hall. Yet the atmosphere shifted. Without the pressure of an ongoing war, tensions eased. Guards relaxed, friendships grew bolder, and a sense of limbo settled over the camps. No longer enemies in the heat of battle. The prisoners were now men without a cause, adrift in time. Sports thrived too. Soccer tournaments pitted barracks against one another, while some prisoners even learned the rules of baseball, giving the strange American game a try. Competition eased boredom, while laughter softened the bitterness of confinement. Education expanded further. With time on their hands, many prisoners joined classes in English, mathematics, or history. Lectures were given by fellow captives with academic backgrounds, professors, teachers, and even priests who had once worn uniforms. For some, these months became an unexpected university, knowledge replacing despair. But not all was light. Letters from home painted grim pictures. Cities reduced to rubble, food scarce, families displaced. Some men learned their loved ones had been killed in bombings. Others discovered wives and children wandering refugee camps. The guilt grew sharper. Here in captivity, they ate 3 meals a day, sometimes with donuts or Coca-Cola as treats, while their families struggled to survive. The weight of that contrast pressed heavily on their conscience. Still, many found comfort in small acts of kindness. American guards shared cigarettes or swapped stories. Local civilians attended concerts or invited work details to picnics. In these moments, prisoners glimpsed something more enduring than fences, the possibility of reconciliation. Yet the uncertainty remained. When would they go home? And what kind of home would they return to? Some feared retribution. Others dreaded the sight of destroyed towns. A few wondered if the world they had known was gone forever. As seasons passed, the camps became peculiar communities, suspended between war and peace. Prisoners built friendships, argued politics, dreamed of the future. The longer they stayed, the more American culture seeped in: music, food, even slang. One soldier wrote in his journal, "I arrived an enemy. Now I feel less certain who I am." The war had ended, but their captivity had not, and in that strange twilight, the seeds of change grew even stronger. Eventually, the fences opened. Ships would carry the men back across the Atlantic, back to a homeland in ruins. And there, the shock would not be Coca-Cola or donuts, but the devastation of a Germany they barely recognized. The ships that had once carried German soldiers into captivity now carried them back across the Atlantic. The war was over, the camps were closing, and it was time to send the men home. Yet for many prisoners, the journey filled them with unease. They had lived in America for months, some for years, surrounded by abundance and stability. What would they find when the ship's gangway touched German soil? The answer came in silence and rubble. In the port cities of Bremen and Hamburg, men stepped onto the docks and stood frozen. Where once had been bustling markets and proud town squares, there now lay heaps of bricks, twisted metal, and broken walls. Smoke still rose from ruins. Children with hollow eyes wandered the streets. Mothers in patched coats searched for food in the wreckage. For the returning soldiers, it was a jarring reversal. They had eaten donuts and Coca-Cola in captivity. Here, bread was rationed and scarce. They had worked under guard but been paid wages. Here, jobs were gone, factories destroyed. In America, they had written letters on clean paper, bought soap at canteens, played music in evenings. In Germany, they found scarcity, silence, and suspicion. The emotional toll was heavy. Many prisoners carried guilt sharper than ever before. "We lived better as captives than our families did as free people," one man admitted. Letters exchanged during captivity had hinted at hardship, but to see it firsthand was crushing. Some men wept openly when they saw their homes reduced to ashes, their families scattered or lost. And then came the disbelief of their neighbors. When former prisoners spoke of life in America, they were often met with skepticism or hostility. Tales of donuts for breakfast, of Coca-Cola bottles, of libraries and concerts in camp sounded too fantastical. How could the enemy have treated them better than their own government? Some accused them of exaggeration. Others whispered that they had been softened by the Americans. Yet not all dismissed their stories. In villages and towns, returned POWs shared glimpses of a different world. One where democracy allowed free speech, where even in war an enemy was treated with dignity, where music and food were plentiful. Around dinner tables, in taverns, in churchyards, these quiet accounts sowed seeds of doubt about the Reich's propaganda. The irony cut deep. These men, who had once been told that America was their mortal foe, became accidental ambassadors of its culture. They described Coca-Cola as a drink of bubbling energy, donuts as sweet luxuries, and newspapers as windows of honesty. They spoke of swing music and baseball games, of farmers who shared pie after long days in the fields. What had seemed like trivial experiences inside barbed wire now became symbols of something larger, a society utterly unlike the dictatorship they had served. Still, reintegration was not easy. Germany was in ruins, both physically and morally. Some men struggled with bitterness, clinging to the past. Others tried to forget captivity altogether, ashamed of having survived more comfortably than their families. But many carried their experiences quietly, letting them shape how they approached the future. In the years that followed, These returning prisoners played a subtle but important role in Germany's recovery. They were among the first to speak of democracy not as an abstract idea, but as something they had witnessed firsthand. They knew it was possible for a society to be both strong and free, both disciplined and humane. For them, donuts and Coca-Cola were not just treats. They were emblems of abundance, fairness, and possibility. One former prisoner later recalled, "In America, I learned that an enemy could treat me as a man. When I came home, I wished my country had done the same." The return from captivity was thus more than a homecoming. It was a collision between the abundance of America and the devastation of Germany, between memories of kindness and the reality of ruin. And from that collision emerged a legacy. In the decades that followed, the taste of donuts and Coca-Cola, the memories of kindness in captivity, would ripple through lives and nations, shaping the bonds between former enemies. Decades later, at a reunion in Germany, a group of elderly men sat around a wooden table, their uniforms long gone, their hair turned white. They were not veterans of a triumphant army, but former prisoners of war. The conversation was not of tanks or battles, but of something far sweeter. One man laughed as he recalled his first glazed donut. Another raised a glass of soda and said, "It was the fizz that I never forgot." The memories of barbed wire and captivity had faded into the background. What remained were the tastes and moments that had changed them. The legacy of America's prisoner of war camps was profound, though not always obvious. At the time, critics at home questioned the policy. Why treat the enemy with such generosity? Why waste resources on men who had fought to destroy freedom? Yet the results of that generosity rippled far beyond the fences. For thousands of German soldiers, their years in American captivity became their first exposure to democracy in action. They had seen guards who enforced rules firmly but fairly. They had read newspapers that criticized leaders without fear. They had joined classes, debated politics, listened to jazz, and tasted foods that symbolized abundance. These experiences, seemingly trivial at the moment, carried deep weight when the men returned home. In post-war Germany, some of these former prisoners became teachers, journalists, or local leaders. They spoke of a different way of life, one that valued openness and fairness. In villages devastated by defeat, their voices carried authority. They had seen democracy not in books, but in practice, and they remembered that even behind barbed wire, they had been treated as men, not as enemies. The cultural legacies were lighter, but no less significant. Coca-Cola, once a curiosity tasted in camps, became a global symbol of America in the years after the war. As the company expanded into Germany during the late 1940s and 1950s, many Germans greeted it not as a foreign invasion of culture, but as a familiar taste from captivity. The same was true of donuts and other American foods. What had begun as luxuries in a camp mess hall became part of everyday life in a rebuilding nation. Relationships also endured. Former prisoners and their American guards, or the farm families who had once hosted them for work, kept in touch through letters. Some returned to visit the United States decades later as free men. A few even emigrated, bringing their families to settle in the land where they had once been captives. At reunions, there were hugs instead of salutes, laughter instead of suspicion. The enemy had become a friend. Historians later pointed out the irony. While weapons had destroyed the Third Reich, donuts and Coca-Cola had helped soften its legacy. The power of abundance, kindness, and everyday humanity had done what bombs could not, left Germans questioning the ideology that had led them to war. America had wielded its culture not as a weapon of destruction, but as a quiet force of influence. For many former prisoners, the memories carried a lasting emotional warmth. In interviews conducted decades later, Men spoke not of humiliation, but of surprise. They remembered the sweetness of sugar, the strangeness of fizz, the friendliness of a farm wife offering pie after a long day's work. In these small details, they found symbols of hope, evidence that even in war, humanity could prevail. The lesson of the camps was not that war was gentle. It was brutal, merciless, and tragic. But within that storm, the treatment of German prisoners in America revealed something rare, a glimpse of reconciliation before the war had even ended. The closing image is powerful. A young German soldier in 1944, sitting behind barbed wire, sipping his first Coca-Cola, unaware that decades later he would tell his grandchildren about that taste, not as bitterness, but as wonder. Final reflection. In the end, the legacy of donuts and Coca-Cola is not about food or drink. It is about what they represented: abundance, kindness, and the possibility of seeing an enemy as human. The prisoners who once braced for cruelty discovered generosity instead. And in that discovery, they carried home a truth that outlasted the war. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, coffee, a donut, a bottle of soda, can change not only a man's life, but the future relationship between nations.